let's move on to some of the other aspects of this executive order, because it's kind of a hodgepodge of things in there. What's one of the other areas where you're concerned? I know that we were talking beforehand, and the DoD contracts is an area that you could see potentially having a wider effect.
Yeah, so I think there are three other ones that stuck out. So one is President Biden directs the Department of Defense to essentially come up with a set of principles and factors they want to use when to implement sort of gun safety principles when the DoD acquires guns for the military. Mm-hmm. Now, on the one hand, that sounds like a bit of a word salad, and it is. On the other hand, I think it's pretty clear that the intent there is to have the DoD essentially with these principles say, look, we are not going to buy guns for the military from companies or contractors that do not implement X, Y, and Z gun control policies, of their own accord, even though it's not mandated by law. For example, we will not acquire small arms from a company that does not, on the civilian side of their sales, require someone to be 21 or wait 10 days. Impose their own waiting periods,
right?
Or those sorts of things, or who sells quote assault weapons to in states where they're not prohibited, those sorts of things,
right? Or invest into smart gun technology or whatever. Right. This is that. I think if you're old enough, I guess, might recall the Smith & Wesson deal with the Clinton administration, where in exchange for backing off of the sort of frivolous lawsuit endeavors that people had gone on, Smith & Wesson had agreed to invest into smart gun technology. And that, that's actually, I think, leads into one of the major hurdles that any plan like that with the DoD is going to face, which is that that almost bankrupted Smith & Wesson. Smith & Wesson almost went out of business because of the backlash to that, to agreeing to that deal. And their CEO had to resign. It was a total mess. And I don't think any gun company today would actually go through with something like that unless their plan was to never sell guns outside of the military ever again.
Right. Which I mean, realistically, there have been some companies in recent years that have said we are going to move toward focusing more exclusively on military and police and government sales. Mm-hmm. Whether or not that has worked out for them, I will not be the arbiter of truth in that regard. But I think it's very clear that for some of them that has not worked out.
Yeah.
But I think you also have, so you have that problem, right? Of on the civilian gun control side, you have the government trying to, in a roundabout way, impose gun control that it can't get through the democratic process.
Right.
But on the other hand, this is actually a national security issue. Like if this rule turns out as a worst case scenario where it really is not just a word salad, but the government really saying the DoD will not acquire small arms from any company that doesn't do this, you're now limiting national security choices based on companies' willingness to impose gun control instead of on which company has the best firearms for our military. And I think realistically, this turns out not to be a nothing burger per se, but to be less of an issue. I think it's easy for the DoD to at least try to say that they're doing something here because they already just recently signed a deal with, I think, Sig Sauer for the next generation combat firearms. So realistically, they're not going to be making mass acquisitions of that nature for potentially decades, unless something goes horribly south. So it kind of like takes it off their shoulders. Like, we don't have to acquire new weapons contracts for several decades, but if we did, we wouldn't consider it unless the companies did X, Y, and Z. Again, it's.
I mean, I think even that would be super problematic for DOT, right? Like, do you really want to alienate an entire political party and hundreds of millions of Americans?
Oh yeah.
For this, like, I understand that certainly it does seem that would be the goal of something like this from the Biden administration, is to get DOD to try and backdoor, gun control through their acquisition process. But it also reminds me a lot of these strict gun control laws in places like California or Illinois or anywhere really that there are bans on magazines or certain kinds of guns. What you always see is the police being exempted from those bans because they don't want to have to use the guns that that are still legal. Like California is the perfect example of this, right? The handgun roster, the unsafe handgun roster they have in California.
They're so unsafe that only cops can have them.
Exactly. He's got this whole list of, you can't have a handgun unless it's got a magazine safety or a loaded chamber indicator, and whatever. People can debate whether they like those features or not, or whether they, obviously the big one is microstamping, because it's not a technology that actually exists in practice anywhere. No guns in the world have that technology incorporated into them, and it's questionable as to whether they even could. But the police get exemptions from these things. They get exemptions because the police don't actually want to be forced to use those sort of guns. And so, that's what this reminds me of. Like, the military isn't going to want to actually use smart guns in the vast majority of situations because of the shortcomings of that, the inherent shortcomings of adding like biometrics into a safety mechanism or what have you. There's a lot of things in that realm, or try to, limit the design. And I think they'll get in a lot of, that'll create a lot of political problems for DOD if they start trying to use acquisitions in this highly political way.
Well, I think you bring up a good point. I immediately went to the assumption is that this is going to try to be backdoor gun control, and not that this is going to be trying to implement those principles on the military or police themselves, because that would just be so absurd. It is intuitively absurd that the government would ever, that any soldier in combat would be like, yeah, you know what I really want is a gun that may or may not work with smart technology. That if I need to pick up my buddy's gun, right, because I'm out of ammo or he's down, well, now I can't use it because it doesn't have my fingerprint. Right. Or, that has a magazine
the fingerprint reader
lock.
Is wet if you've ever used the cell phone.
Right. Or it has a magazine lock, so I can't quickly change out my mag. Right. No government agent, whether it's military or civilian side, is going to want that. So I don't even think it crossed anybody's mind that that's what the word salad meant, because you're right, it is so absurd. But then they flip around and say, but these are the strategies we want to implement on the civilian side.
Yeah, we want to force
because you guys, it doesn't matter. If you're in a life or death situation and the government isn't there to protect you, well, that's fine if your gun doesn't work. But for us, we're really special. So,
but that's one potential risk, or like potentially aggressive angle they could go, is this DOD path, regardless of these shortcomings we're talking about. What was, you had two more. What were the other two?
So I think one of the other ones, it was a directive for the Department of Transportation to, I forget the exact wording, but essentially do something, look at doing something about thefts and losses of firearms being transferred between FFLs when in commerce, right? So when they're being shipped from manufacturers to gun stores, or being stolen from gun stores, and to an extent, this is a problem. I don't think anyone would seriously suggest it's not a bad thing that guns are stolen in transit. That said, it's a minor part of the overall problem. So I think it's like several thousand guns a year that are reported missing or lost in transit or from gun stores due to theft or loss or anything. But some of the numbers suggest that there are potentially over 100,000 guns in total that get stolen around the nation. So it's very clearly a very small part of that problem. I think most guns that are getting stolen and winding up on the black market are from people leaving their guns unlocked in cars, or their house is getting broken into and their guns stolen that way. So it's definitely an issue. But I think the concern here is, again, what is the worst case scenario that we could expect from an administration that is trying to find ways to make guns more expensive and impose more burdens on Second Amendment rights. And so I think some of those scenarios could include, if you stretch it to its limit and say, for example, in order to prevent firearm thefts and loss in transit, FFLs and manufacturers can only ship firearms in special armored train cars with 25 armored guards minimum and are presumed responsible for any losses that occur, and it's a felony, right? All of a sudden, this has a chilling effect on manufacturing and guns actually being marketed to the public, right. Because you have this problem of that becomes a tremendous burden on the manufacturing side. And even if it can be met, that this is realistic, that those costs get passed on to the consumer. Right? So it becomes a de facto tax. So that's, again, I'm not suggesting that is exactly what will happen, but it's certainly, I think, within the realm of possibilities that this is used not just as a legitimate means of trying to prevent loss, but as a backdoor means of imposing on the manufacturing side taxes and burdens that then get passed on to consumers, or run certain, some of the smaller FFLs out of business because they just can't comply.